First up on the show, continuing its relentless aerial onslaught on Ukraine, Russia targeted the cities of Kyiv and Lviv with missiles and drones. The attacks came a day after more than 50 people were killed in a missile attack on the city of Poltava. Now, meanwhile, Russian forces also claimed to have destroyed Ukrainian military targets in Kursk region using aircraft and air defense missiles. The mayor of Lviv also said that Russia's early morning attack on the western Ukrainian city has killed 7 people, including 3 children. Officials said that this strike also destroyed historic buildings in the heart of the city, which is not far from the border with the NATO member Poland. Displaying its superior air power, Russia has widened its assault on Ukraine in the last few days. On Tuesday, the city of Poltava became witness to the war's deadliest single attack this year. Russia claimed that the target was a military institute which was being used to train military specialists from the Ukrainian army in radar and electronic warfare systems. Now, Ukraine confirmed that military personnel were among those killed in the attack. The attack could deal a blow to Kyiv as it tries to bolster its ranks to hold off a major powerful enemy. Now, the foreign ministry said that the use of ballistic missiles meant the victims had little time to find cover after the air raid siren was sounded. Now, it is not the first time Russia has struck military facilities away from the front lines, causing mass casualties. In March 2022, 35 people were killed in a Russian strike on a military base in the country's west. In May that year, Russia said that it hit a training ground for reserve forces in the town of Desna, where Ukraine said 87 people were killed. Meanwhile, Russia also seemed to be using its air power to repel the Ukrainian incursion in Kursk. The Russian Defense Ministry released images to show that the Sukhoi 34 aircraft crew destroying a concentration of Ukrainian manpower and armored vehicles. It also released images of a Pantsir S-1 air defense missile and gun system claiming to show the destruction of a Ukrainian armed forces UAV. Now, the past week has seen a marked intensification of Russia's missile and drone strikes, with Ukraine enduring its heaviest bombardment yet. On Monday, ballistic and cruise missiles had targeted Kyiv, causing loud explosions. Ukraine launched its own counteroffensive, deploying over 150 drones to target Russian infrastructure, including an oil refinery near Moscow and a power station. The barrage of missiles and drones also overwhelmed Ukrainian air defense systems. Kyiv has been pushing for more long-range weaponry. The US is reportedly close to finalizing an agreement to provide Ukraine with long-range cruise missiles capable of reaching deep into Russia. However, Kyiv may have to wait several months for these missiles to actually arrive. Meanwhile, Russia has warned that Moscow will give an immediate and extremely painful response in the event of long-range strikes on Russian territory.
They are losing the sense of reality. They are not thinking about the risk of further dangerous escalation of the conflict, even when it comes to their own interests. It's not about Ukraine or Ukrainian citizens anymore. They've long forgotten about them. They're not thinking about themselves. We would like to warn such irresponsible politicians in EU countries and behind the ocean. If such aggressive steps are taken by the Kiev regime, Russia's response will be immediate. I think many of that you have already been observing in the last days, and it will be extremely painful.
Now, on the battlefield, Russian forces continue to make advances in eastern Ukraine, where fighting is particularly intense near the city of Pokrovsk. And joining us to talk more about this is Dr. Malcolm Davis, Senior Analyst in Defence Strategy and Capability, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, who joins us live on the broadcast from Canberra. Malcolm Davis, thanks very much indeed for talking to WION this afternoon. Now, we saw that Tuesday was the deadliest single-day attack in the war this year, and Russia used ballistic missiles. With all its recent gains, particularly in the east of Ukraine, has Russia proved it's obviously the stronger military force and has vast air superiority?
Look, I think you are seeing the Russians making steady advances in the east around Donetsk towards Pokrovsk and Kramatorsk. And I think what's happening is the Ukrainians are undermanned, they're running low on ammunition, and so they're having to withdraw in order to preserve their forces, and that's basically ceding ground. The Russians are filling that ground and basically making advances. At the same time, you've got these very effective air and missile strikes that are occurring. The Russians not needing to actually fly their aircraft inside Ukrainian airspace. They can launch these glide bombs and these cruise missiles from outside Ukrainian airspace whilst they're in Russia. And so they can strike at targets with impunity across Ukraine. Ukraine only has limited air defense missile capabilities provided by the West. So Ukraine is in a bad situation at the moment.
Yeah, and as it is in a bad situation, Malcolm Davis, heads are beginning to roll in Ukraine, and more cabinet reshuffles are likely, even as Zelensky is heading to the U.S. to meet Biden, and obviously will be talking about those air defense systems that he believes are, are hugely required at this moment.
Exactly, and it's not just the defensive systems that are necessary to shoot down incoming missiles. It's also that Zelensky wants the Biden administration to lift onerous constraints on the ability of Ukraine to use US supplied weapons to strike deep in Russia. If these restrictions are lifted, then Ukraine can hit air bases from which these Russian air attacks are coming from, and thus stop these attacks from occurring. That will help save lives. It will reduce the pressure on the Ukrainians, potentially allowing them to stabilize their defensive lines and preventing a Russian breakout near Pokrovsk. And I think it's really important that the Biden administration actually listens to what Zelensky is saying and accepts that these constraints are unacceptable, immoral, and need to be lifted as soon as possible.
Right. And as we see the Russians making more and more gains going forward in this war, do you think things have dramatically changed and the NATO members, the West and America will have to sit down and rethink some of their strategies of support in Ukraine? And which also means...
Look, I think that...
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that any rethink would need to be along the lines of, rather than, we stand with Ukraine, that the policy must be, we must ensure Ukraine wins. It cannot be that NATO decides Ukraine can't win, so therefore they turn their backs on Ukraine. I think what needs to happen is for NATO to sit down and look at what their strategy is and recognize they need to do more. They need to step up and they need to provide additional weapons to Ukraine. They need to remove any constraints on the use of those weapons. And they may also need to think about some sort of direct involvement, either by providing a limited missile defense zone in western Ukraine, so that frees up Ukrainian forces there to go to the east. And I think Poland has already indicated a willingness to shoot down Russian missiles that are approaching Polish territory over Ukraine. So these are the sorts of things that I think NATO needs to do. It certainly should not think about withdrawing support and essentially abandoning Ukraine.
Yeah. And so going forward, you certainly feel that the time for wait and watch in this war has gone for the West, particularly for NATO members and the US, and of course maintaining of status quo as the Russians continue to make substantial gains. Now, the head of the International Atomic Energy has said that the situation at the Russian-occupied Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is very fragile following the recent attack close by. Are you hopeful that both sides will be wary of that kind of an escalation in this war?
Oh, actually, I worry that the Russians would use the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant as a kind of grey zone nuclear threat. They hold it, they control it. If they wanted to, they could try to release radioactivity and claim that it was some sort of Ukrainian operation. That's the nature of a false flag operation by the Russians, and certainly that would be some sort of step short of Russia using tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine. So I do not believe that we should expect the Russians will do the right thing and honor their obligations under the International Atomic Energy Agency. In fact, I think the Russians will use Zaporizhzhia as basically a sword of Damocles over the Ukrainian people. And indeed, when you talk about radiation and the radiation clouds blowing in the wind, the rest of Europe
Yeah, and while you talk about this direct involvement of the NATO possibly in some areas, how do we de-escalate the situation going forward if it were to? I mean, what sort of negotiations would it require? What sort of involvement possibly would it require from a country like China, maybe India?
You don't negotiate with the Russians. Essentially, you defeat them. And I think that's what we need to be looking at. If we start negotiating with the Russians, then any negotiation requires give or take on both sides. The Russians would essentially demand that they control the territories that they have gained, they have annexed through military aggression. They would demand that Ukraine not join NATO. That's unacceptable. So therefore, I do not think the time for negotiations is now. I think you negotiate from a position of strength. So what needs to happen is that the West needs to ensure that Ukraine regains the momentum, regains the offensive, and can push the Russians back out of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, and then you sit down and negotiate the terms of Russia's surrender, not give Russia essentially victory by default.
Right. Dr. Malcolm Davis, Senior Analyst in Defense Strategy, thanks very much indeed for joining us this afternoon, sharing those very important thoughts on what's going on in this war at the moment.
Thank you.
For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.